I think that going to university may be the biggest mistake that anyone could probably pursue at this point in time. Ended up getting final round interviews for a management consulting position at Bain & Co, closing a pre-seed round for UC Berkeley, contingent on the fact that we'd be moving to San Francisco for a period of time. And so that leads me into what I'm doing now. I'd since quit my job in order to solve this problem. What's going on, guys? No Life Polls here, coming at you with a new YouTube video. I know it's been a hot minute. It's been a little while, actually. The last video I posted was almost 5 years ago, and a lot's obviously happened since then. I don't know if this is going to be the right type of video to encapsulate all the shenanigans that has occurred in my life over the last 5 years, but as you can tell, I'm an aged man. I mean, some might say I still look 16, but I feel to be an aged man. I feel like in the last 5 years, I've had so much embedded trauma in my mind that I'm a completely different person to who I once was, to who you probably remember me to be. The last video I posted, I was just looking on my YouTube channel, was Study With Me, a 1.5 hour Study With Me video. This was published 4 years ago, obviously prior to the release of ChatGPT, which basically just made the entire process of studying obsolete, to say the least. I originally created this YouTube channel because I wanted to inspire young people who were, going through the university rat race, trying to figure out exactly where they wanted to go and how to get there and how to navigate the university landscape. Fast forward, I think that going to university may be the biggest mistake that anyone could probably pursue at this point in time. The reason being because AI has basically just made a fuckload of jobs obsolete. There are a plethora of things you can do to enhance your ability to learn, but if you're at the very early days and the early stages of your life and you are wondering whether or not you should double down in high school and double down on going to university, the reality is the world that we live in 5 or 10 years down the line from now is probably going to be unrecognizable, which is a little bit of a shame, because I feel like there is an inherent value to going to university if you go there to solidify a solid foundation and you obtain the ability to learn anything. I was able to figure out how to learn concepts that I had a lot of resistance sitting down and trying to actually overcome. Besides the point, new location, what's happened in the last 4 to 5 years? I remember starting my PhD back in 2021. I was keen to slay the dragon of academia. I had a fucking awesome ride. I basically was at a crossroads at a time when I was trying to determine if I should go into medical school or if I should go into a PhD program. And serendipitously, I met someone who changed my entire life. And that was my PhD professor. After going through a hard slog in my honors year with a supervisor from the south side of Chicago, this is someone who, if you've ever seen the TV show The Bear, basically Kami's supervisor was like this guy, right? He basically f***ed my entire life up, but he made me good enough to be recognized by people who were of a high status in this field. That being my supervisor, who was based out of the Peter MacCallum Cancer Center. I ended up choosing to do a PhD with him on the basis that he gave me the capacity to create my own research project from the ground up, right? Now, usually when you go into a PhD project, you go through the PhD program and your supervisor has a very clear direction and vision as to what it is that their lab is pursuing and what the research topic is that you as a PhD student are going to be taking on. My supervisor gave me the capacity to pick my own research project within the confines of his expertise, which in this case was metastatic disease. I ended up identifying a very interesting area of cancer research, which is called pre-metastatic development. Basically what this is that before cancer spreads around the body, let's say for example, someone unfortunately gets breast cancer, before that cancer actually spreads around the body to the lung, the brain, etc., those secondary sites of metastasis, those secondary organs, the lung, the brain, they're actually changing and cultivating an environment that allows for tumor cells to arrive and thrive upon arrival. The best way to think about this is like an analogy of an airplane that takes off at an airport, an established airport. These airplanes in the sky, they have to land somewhere. They can't just land in the desert, right? They can't just land in the forest. They have to land in a pre-established environment. Much the same in cancer. It's a thought that a lot of people overlook, but that's what I spent my entire last 4-year dissertation pursuing, which was fucking awesome, right? I took it all the way through development of experimental models where we were using animal models in order to recapitulate that early stage progression of disease, and then basically identifying some cellular molecular changes, particularly in the lung before cancer arrives in those very nascent early stages of metastasis, and was able to use that project to basically triage a list of therapeutic candidates that I was able to engineer a recombinant protein to target in order to ideally prevent or dissuade the spread of metastasis. But obviously it's a complex system, didn't go as necessarily planned. We found some interesting data. I'm currently in the process of publishing that since finishing my PhD. Besides the point, one of the unique things about my PhD was that my PhD supervisor gave me the capacity to pursue several startups along the way. As he mentioned to me in the early days of my PhD, that getting a PhD these days is just simply not enough, right? You have to go above and beyond in order to separate yourself from the cohort of people who are just getting PhDs left, right, and center. And so he gave me the ability there to explore my entrepreneurial spirits, and that led me into starting my first company, which was an absolute failure. Nonetheless, I've learned a lot in the process. I'm not technical. I don't code. I don't know how to code. I know a little bit these days since completing like courses like CS50 online and things, but it's very rudimentary. I've also learned it in order to try to navigate the space and be able to delegate and talk to people at a somewhat technical level so that if I have an idea, I know roughly what might be involved in executing it, not at the low level, but at a high level, so that at least I don't look like a fool. I started a software development company. The intention here was if I can offer software as a service, maybe I can learn a little bit about the nomenclature and the language that's used in this space, and ideally that might help me somewhere down the line when I try to create an app or some type of application, SaaS project, or whatever have you. That was fantastic. It kind of also happened serendipitously. I was crossing the road one night after a late night of studying, and a person who was staying in my student accommodation drove past and was like, "Yo, Ollie, what are you doing, bro? Like, you want to catch up? Maybe we can go for a drive." That conversation literally led to us standing on a bridge, and then eventually we went into becoming the first company that I started with. There was a lot to say there, but obviously at the end of the day, worked on that project for like 2.5 years. We had some early stage student clients that we were developing software for, but it just wasn't really progressing at the level that I wanted it to. And so I ended up putting that on the shelf, but I put it on the shelf for something else. Towards the latter end of that project, I participated in a pitch competition through the University of Melbourne's School of Business, and that was super insightful because that gave me the ability to network with a bunch of individuals. I didn't win that competition, but during the process ended up getting into the finals and meeting a lot of high-level individuals from University of Melbourne. This was super exciting because I had never pitched at this point. This is the first pitch that I ever actually did. Basically taught me the fundamentals on how to put a pitch together effectively, and I've since used that knowledge throughout the journey. Now, during the finals of this, I actually met someone who would soon then become my next co-founder of a new company. I remember meeting this person and thinking to myself that they did a good pitch. I liked the way they articulated themselves. I reached out to them before they announced the winners and just gave him props for the good pitch that he did. Anyway, neither of us ended up winning, but several months later, we ended up crossing paths again as we were walking across the road. I know, right? Like, all these things that happened in my life just happened because I'm crossing the road at some particular point in time. But I crossed the road, this guy was like, "Oh, yo, how you been?" This, that, and the other. What ended up happening was we went to coffee, like, the days after, and we literally just, like, started spitballing ideas at a cafe. In the early days of this, it was really just, like, back of the napkin ideas, writing these ideas down and seeing what might stick. There was a competition that was on the horizon there, which is called the MedTech Actuator. Participated in this with an idea we literally wrote on the back of a napkin. Because metastasis is the leading cause of cancer-related deaths, early detection is a really good preventative mechanism for the disease itself. And so I spitball this idea right down, like maybe we can do like a blood test, some kind of at-home concierge-style blood test where we can actually track whether or not people have circulating tumor cells in their blood or something of that nature. That night we signed up to MedTech Actuator. Qualification round was like in days to come. So we spent that night putting together a pitch deck and a script, and it ended up getting us through the qualifiers all the way through to the finals, which is awesome. We ended up going to the finals, meeting a bunch of other people in MedTech, biotech space. Didn't win the competition, but I think that was the point where I thought to myself that there was some good synergies between me and my co-founder and that we might work well together on another project. So we put it on the shelf, but we pursued another idea. And this was at the time when ChatGPT became publicly available. I was like super skeptical at the time when ChatGPT came out because I'm an academic and definitely valued at the time the nature of the educational system, particularly when it comes to writing through doing. And ChatGPT basically throws that whole notion on its head because you no longer need to really know how to write, but instead you just need to know what good looks like. ChatGPT came out, students started using it to write their assignments. Assignments were like a core mechanism, a metric as to how well you would do in a university degree. Universities were shitting their pants because they thought that students would be cognitively offloading the process of writing their assignments. There were a bunch of apps that came out to try to catch them using AI for writing assignments. The students didn't like this, they almost rebelled against it. The apps themselves had high false positive rates, which was leading to this whole ethical issue of misdiagnosing students who were cheating. This was leading to a whole lot more admin at the university level. These apps were using perplexity and predictability of language in order to determine if a student was using AI. It gave you a percentage of plagiarism based on whether or not they thought you were writing with AI. But at this time, instead of predicting whether or not a student was using AI, we actually came up with this unique concept where we would use the AI to interview the students using the assignment as context in order to use metrics like familiarity as a proxy for authenticity. So basically you'd get a questionnaire on your assignment, and if you supposedly have written it, you should be familiar with what's in the document. Based on your speed of response and based on the quality of your response, we'd be able to determine if we thought that you might have been cognitively offloading the process of writing the assignment. Anyway, it turns out from a pedagogical perspective that doesn't actually matter, and they actually just ended up changing the way that students completed assignments. That's a whole nother thing. So this was about a year later from the previous competition. What ended up happening was we went back to the pitch competition that my co-founder and I met at. We came up with this super emotive pitch that basically said that if the universities fumble this opportunity to get ahead of the curve, that it may ruin the sanctity of the entire educational system. That ended up winning us the University of Melbourne pitch competition, which was a fucking win. That was actually this document right here. So it was $8,000, which was a little bit of dough to get the ball rolling. Basically, that gave us the ability to register the company and get the ball rolling. Now, to be honest, at the time when I was doing this pitch, I was still in the middle of a PhD. I was still doing early mornings and late nights in the lab. And so I reflected on whether or not this is actually going to be a legitimate business or if this is just going to be a bit of a hustle to earn a little bit of extra dough during the PhD program, given that at this point I'm only earning like $34,000, $37,000 a year or something rather. So what ended up happening was on the back end of winning that competition, we refined the pitch slightly. We went around town and just basically back to back started winning a bunch of competitions in order to increase the amount of money that we raised. Grants, pitch competitions at different universities, at different ecosystems. We ended up raising around $50,000 in non-dilutive funding. But obviously at this point, we were getting a lot of salience, a lot of attention, particularly on places like LinkedIn. And so we were trying to figure out, well, are we actually going to commit to this as a real business? Or is this going to be a bit of a thing that just fades away in the clouds? It was at this point where we started bringing other people onto the team, people who had noticed some of these wins along the way. This brought us to working with some very high quality individuals who have since gone along the journey and actually started working for very prestigious companies, including Amazon, all the way to startups like Heidi Health, one of the fastest growing healthcare AI companies in Australia, if not parts of the world, all the way to a colleague of mine who has now gone off to work for XAI. Anyway, we decided to take it a little bit more seriously. I'm going to skip the details here because it's not necessarily important. This is more of like a general update. But we tried to raise capital in Australia for like 8 months or so. All the venture capitalists in Australia were a little bit too like, oh, you know, you're too early, we need more traction, like all this other stuff. That's kind of like a whole thing in itself. We had like $2,000 left in the account at one point, or like $3,000, and kind of everyone was getting a little bit worn out. We had some early stage pilots that were kind of going along the way through the University of Melbourne. Anyway, we ended up going to the US with the last amount of money that we had, going on a short trip in January 2024 to San Francisco, Boston, and New York. First time I've been to America. It was kind of a wild ride. We ended up staying in a hacker house in San Francisco. It was a big ass fucking mansion filled with a bunch of cracked coders. Along the way, we basically tried to set up consecutive meetings with VCs or startup founders anyone and everyone in San Francisco, Boston, and New York who could put us in touch with the right people along the way in order to hopefully raise a round of capital. Within the 2-week period, we didn't raise a round of capital, but we ended up building connections that eventually led to someone pointing in the direction of these startup incubators. Y Combinator, which we'd already applied to and been rejected for, and another one which was called Berkeley Skydeck, run through the Haas School of Business through University of California, Berkeley. Anyway, we ended up applying to a bunch of different places, eventuated ourselves in the next few months to closing a pre-seed round through UC Berkeley, contingent on the fact that we'd be moving to San Francisco for a period of time. Mind you, I was towards the latter end of my PhD here. I was in the thick of it, trying to basically engineer and purify a recombinant protein. It's kind of weird on that side of things because at Peter Mac, you'd think that there'd be a lot of researchers with helping hands and people who really understand this space, but there's a lot of computational things happening in the biomedical space at the moment. And so I often felt like I was just cherry picking information from the literature, trying to get Zoom calls and Google Meets with people who knew what they were doing in this space in order to try to understand it myself so I could apply it in the lab. Anyway, that side of things ended up evolving. I purified the protein and was able to basically test it in vitro and in vivo in order to find functionality and then do some preliminary studies in animal models to see what effect it had on the prevention of metastasis. But once I finished that experiment, what I ended up doing was taking a leave of absence from my PhD. So I basically dropped everything that I had here in Australia, which meant that I was moving away from my family, my girlfriend, brother, my sister at a time when a bunch of shit was happening on that side of things in the family. Everybody's got shit going on in their life at every point in time. I'm no exception to that. This was a wild ride. I basically rocked up on the 4th of July, ended up networking with a bunch of people through the Berkeley Skydeck program. We ended up rocking up to a bar and ended up in like the tallest building penthouse in San Francisco at a startup party. These things happen all the time in San Francisco. I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment with 4 other engineers. We're basically rotating the beds on a nightly basis. Whoever worked the hardest got to sleep in the bed. Full hacker house vibes, diabolical amounts of caffeine. Very much what you want in an early stage startup. San Francisco is one of those places that's just full of cracked engineers. Basically, you're homeless or working for some kind of startup or large scaler. Anyway, along the journey here, there were a lot of things that happened and a lot of things that I overlooked throughout the entire journey. And for the sake of it, I'm not going to get into it, particularly in this video, to avoid any type of disparagement or anything of that nature. But in the end, to be frank, I had a dispute with my co-founder. We ended up not seeing eye to eye. Being in San Francisco and having the pressure of investors on our shoulders ended up showing sides of each other that didn't really vibe. And so in the end, it basically became impossible to work together. I was put in a really weird position where basically either he was leaving or I was leaving. I basically made the decision that we're not going to work well together in the future. It looks like this is a sinking ship and that we should probably just go our separate ways. And so that's what happened. I ended up leaving, having lost pretty much everything. To be frank, it wasn't a clean breakup. There were a lot of negative things that happened along the way that impacted the company's success, that impacted my own mental health. I ended up coming back to Melbourne to finish my PhD and my dissertation, and putting that project aside as a learning experience for the future. There's a lot more that I want to say there, that I could say, but I'm not going to say at this particular point in time. But what I will say is that you live your entire life collecting all of these different perspectives. And those perspectives, both good and bad, make you who you are as a person. And that builds character. And at the end of the day, your integrity is worth far more than any opportunity on the horizon. And they're priceless. So you can't compromise on your own morality for any reason. And if there are people around you who are starting to change who you are and the way that you perceive yourself in the world, it's probably time to leave. Because chances are you have the skills in order to be successful independently. You don't need to be dragged down and tied down on someone else's terms. And so I came back to Melbourne, I finished my PhD, which is very fortunate, finished a couple of loose end experiments, which I wanted to do before I left, finished writing my thesis, which is awesome. Now that I had completed my PhD, I was at a crossroads. Basically, I had a lot of connections overseas in the US. I had a job offering at both Cornell University and Harvard University for a postdoc role. For those of you who don't know, that's basically an extended research position where you go and pursue a project in a specific domain for a minimum of 2 years. And because I had just come back from the US, I was kind of all up in my head about whether or not it was worth going back at this particular point in time. I know in the future there will always be an opportunity to go back, but I either was going to go double down on academia or potentially lean a little bit more into tech and consolidate some of the lessons I learned through UC Berkeley's Skydeck program. Ended up getting final round interviews for a management consulting position at Bain & Co, as well as DLK in New York. Those interviews were both diabolical, DLK more than anything else, which is a tier 2 consulting firm. This was a 3 a.m. interview that was 4.5 hours long that had 4 different stages. I didn't end up getting either of the roles, which probably worked in my favor because management consulting probably would have just drained all the entrepreneurial juices that I have. So then what I ended up doing was getting a role in tech sales in an app development company. And I know from my experiences in tech at least, that sales funnels and marketing were always a little bit of an empty space in my mind, that I didn't really understand how they work at a technical level. In the first 2 months, I ended up getting a promotion to a more senior role. This is a very well-paying position. There was a commission aspect and a base aspect, but this is where things get super interesting, because even though I liked the sales chase, I found it to be a little bit repetitive and at times monotonous because of that. The sales role itself is very quantitative. You can see how you're performing compared to the cohort. Once you iterate through your sales script and actually become the top performing individual in the sales team, you just need to basically maintain the level of effort and energy into the role. And so at that point, it became less about iterating through the script and more about double downing on the things that I knew were working well for my script. Now, this is where things get super weird, because even though I was in a tech role, there was a little project in my mind that I've been dabbling in since getting back from San Francisco. And that's at the back end of a conversation I was having with my colleague who I did my PhD with, and a friend of mine who I've been working in research with for almost 8 years now. I remember standing in the kitchenette one day and talking to my colleagues about my friend's inflammatory skin condition. So he ended up having like some kind of flare-up or psoriasis or eczema of some description, and was telling us his journey of how he managed to create something that actually solved his problem for him. He ended up going to like all the dermatologists around town, having back-to-back consultations in order to try to fix the skin condition he had. And most doctors would just prescribe him clinical level oral steroids or topical creams that you would rub on your skin in the hopes of reducing the inflammation, but obviously long-term steroid usage has its negative side effects. So as a researcher, he started looking into the literature and figuring out what might actually work for his skin condition. And so what he ended up doing, which is going to sound super weird, was going to a pharmacy and actually looking at probiotics that you can buy on the shelf in pill form. He's not a big fan of taking pills, nor am I and a lot of other people around town. And he got these supplement grade probiotic pills and ended up making his own yogurt culture with them. Anyway, he ended up eating this for an extended period of time, and that ended up fixing his skin condition entirely. So every time he gets a flare up now, he ends up just making a batch of this yogurt, and it basically reduces the flare up completely to the point where it's gone. This got me and my colleagues super interested in the microbiome space, so we started dabbling in it ourselves, having experienced our own skin conditions, all these other issues we were having with brain fog, energy levels, bloating, all these things that have to do with our general modern lifestyles, which are basically killing our gut bacteria. But there's also another story here that got me interested in the microbiome space. I did a short lit review which was looking at the effects of microbiome on chemotherapy. And what this paper found was that by giving a fecal matter transplant, which is when you basically exchange microbiomes or bacteria with a healthy donor, when patients who were experiencing chemotherapy did a fecal matter transplant from patients who had responded well to chemotherapy versus those who didn't receive fecal matter transplants, actually had a much more positive response to chemotherapy to the point where they went into remission, whereas the others who didn't receive a fecal matter transplant ended up getting more ill. This talks levels to the power of the microbiome and the bacteria in your gut. But besides the point, when I think of probiotics, I think of Yakult. We all used to drink it, but all of a sudden we stopped drinking it as we all grew up. Now, Yakult's a great product. One of the first commercially available probiotic drinks that were on the market. This came out in like the 1930s at a time in Japan where no one had effectively isolated particular strains of bacteria. Dr. Schroeder, one of the original founders who has now had microbial strain named after him, ended up isolating this strain and putting it into a probiotic drink that people would consume daily in order to help effectively improve gut health and therefore overall health. Now, the link between gut health and overall well-being is very well documented. You can go out there and look at it. There's a lot of studies out there, some of which I've already mentioned. While at the time it was a part of groundbreaking research, products alike haven't evolved over time with the probiotic market. Probiotic market has evolved a lot since then. The science has evolved a lot since then. All you have to do is go into a supermarket or a pharmacy in order to identify them. But the products we grew up once knew and loved didn't evolve with us, and that's the issue. And as we grew up, we adopted the modern lifestyle, which is full of stresses, lack of sleep, processed foods, copious amounts of sugar, pesticides in our food, overprescription of antibiotics, all these things which are absolutely diabolical for our gut health. And yet when you look on the shelf at the products that exist that are supposedly good for our gut, things like yogurt, things like these probiotic drinks don't include the supplement level probiotics that you would find in pills, and often don't have the diverse set of prebiotics, which are the things that feed the good bacteria. As good bacteria gets fed, they produce lactic acid and other metabolites, which actually end up creating a more balanced gut, which is good for overall well-being. And so that leads me into what I'm doing now, which is super weird because even though I worked in tech sales, I'd since quit my job in order to solve this problem. And I'm still super early days, but my colleague and I, who I did my PhD with, have ended up double downing on this specific project, quitting our high-paying full-time jobs in order to create a modern-day super gut shot that's actually going to be good for people's guts. You can think of it like all the things we once grew up to know and love. That's tasty, somewhat refreshing, and that includes those supplement-level probiotics at the necessary dose in order for them to be effective for overall gut health and overall well-being. This is day one, and I want to document that journey for two reasons. Firstly, if you're Australian and you're out there and you have a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit in you, I want you to understand that you can go out there and chase that dream, and that the only thing really holding you back is the system. And so put the system aside and take a risk, because you never know what might pay off. The second reason is I want to actually go out there and start building a local community here in Melbourne to catch up with people who are also interested in gut health. All things being said, I want this to be an iterative process, because that's what I learned overseas while I was in San Francisco, and that's what I learned throughout my entrepreneurial journey, is that the version that we release on day one is not going to be perfect. And so I want to find people out there who are interested in gut health, who want to help us create the modern day healthy gut shot that's going to change the lives of millions of people around the world. And if that's something that's interesting to you, make sure to reach out to me. And I want to show you guys the product and hand deliver the product to you so that you can see what it looks like, what it tastes like, and how it might be able to help you. With that being said, no life polls, anything's possible. We'll see where we go from here. Take care.